Continue now at the top of Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph Meseches Sanhedrin. This is Sanhedrin Daf 41a. On the previous summit, the Gemara asked, how do we know about Hasra from the Torah? And Ula brings a pasuk. The pasuk says, V'ra'ah es ervasa. Obviously, the sin is being together, is having relations. It's not seeing. And so he understood that to mean V'ra'ah, that it has to be clear to him. It has to be made clear to him through a warning. That's the idea of Hasra. And the Gemara said that it can't be talking about kares, even though over there the punishment is kares. You don't need a warning for kares because that is a punishment bidei shamayim. And so therefore, Taneyu inyan l'malchus. Therefore, we can assume that we're talking about the fact that a warning is required. Hasra is required for malchus, for lashes. Rashi explains today, Winyan lahasras malchus to shayich ba'achoso. It is relevant. You can have malchus by a case of achoso, by a case where one is with one's sister, and therefore you see the concept of hasra. And the Gemara continues with another source. Devei Chizkiya taught in the yeshiva of Chizkiya, they taught v'chiyazid ish al reyehu lahargo biarma. If a person is bemazed purposely, he kills someone else, and the idea is shehisru bo v'adayin hu mezid. What it means to say is that he was warned and he's still doing it on purpose. And Rashi explains v'chiyazid mino yadina, and how do we know that he's doing it on purpose? Ela shehisrubo, it has to be that they warned him. V'yadayin hu mezid, and still he continues to do it. That's what it means b'mezid. Lishnachrina, Rashi says another way to understand v'mezid lo nemar. It doesn't say if he did it b'mezid. Ela v'chiyazid. It says that if he is b'mezid, mashma tamid hu bizdono. That sounds like he's consistently doing it b'mezid. Is that ikr? This is the main explanation. And again, that would imply that there is some kind of warning. And the Gemara continues with another source. Devei Rabbi Shmuel taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Shmuel, it was taught hamotzim oso mekoshesh eitzim. This is by the mekoshesh who violated Shabbos. So again, over there, the implication is shehisrubo, that they warned him. V'yadayin hu mekoshesh, and he was still gathering that wood. And Rashi explains hamotzim oso mekoshesh shekishesh eitzim lo nemar. It doesn't say that he gathered wood. Ela mekoshesh, rather it means he's continuously doing it. Liachar shara'u matzau, after they saw him and they saw that he was doing that, hayem mekoshesh, he continued. Umatam toli bekach. Why is it written in this fashion? Ela shehisrubo v'adayin hayem mekoshesh. Again, obviously he was warned and he continued to do it. And the Gemara continues with another source. Devei Rebbe Tana, in the yeshiva of Rebbe was taught al devar asher ina. This is by a nara hamorasa. It's talking about a situation of adultery, and it says al devar. We understand that to mean al iske dibur, that there was speech, meaning to say, as Rashi says, al iske dibur hasra, there was some kind of warning. And the Gemara says we need all of these various sources. It's necessary to have all of the sources. The Ikos of Rachman achoso, if the Torah only said that by achoso when one is with his sister, hava mina chayve malchus in chayve misas lo. So as we said, that was talking about lashes. I would say by lashes you need a warning, but that's not true by the death penalty. Ikos of Rachman kiyazid, that's why it says kiyazid. Kiyazid is talking about a situation of murder. It involves the death penalty. V'ikos of Rachman v'chiyazid. Now if we only had v'chiyazid by the case of murder, hava mina hani mili sayif. So that's talking a death penalty of sayif, of beheading with the sword to kill. That's a more lenient kind of death penalty. Avoskila dechamura imalo. But when it comes to stoning, which is more strict, I would say not. So tzricha, that's why the last two sources are needed. Both of those sources, the violations by Shabbos, and also when it comes to a nara hamorasa, both of those, the punishment is skila. And the Gemara says v'tarti bin eskol and lamali. But why would we need two sources by skila? Rabbi Shimon. So according to Rabbi Shimon, who says that sreifa is stricter than skila, laisuye nisrafin. So we need that second source. It's an extra source to say this applies even by those who are chayiv sreifa, the death penalty of burning. And l'Rabbanan, according to the Rabbanan, if you already know by skila, so it's obvious by sreifa, it's through a kal v'chomer. According to the Rabbanan, sreifa is more lenient than skila. But milsa da'asi v'kal v'chomer tarach v'kasav l'kras. Sometimes something which can be learned from a kal v'chomer, the pasuk writes it anyhow. And the Gemara continues v'lichtov rachmana bin iskolin v'leiso hanach v'ligmru minei. Why not? Why doesn't the Torah just write it by skila, and then everything can be learned out from skila? Because that's the strictest case. And the Gemara gives the same answer as above. Hachanami here also will just say milsa da'asi b'kal v'chomer, something that could have been learned from a kal v'chomer. Sometimes tarach v'kasav l'kras. Sometimes the pasuk will bother to write it. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Hiter atzmo lemisa, that we asked the witnesses, did the person acknowledge the fact that he understands that what he is doing gets the death penalty? Only then can we give the death penalty. And the Gemara says, Minolan, from where do we know this, that the person has to acknowledge the fact that he understands that he's going to get the death penalty? Amar Rava v'itema Chizkiya, Rava says, and some say Chizkiya says, Amar Kratz, because the pasuk says, Yumas hames, it says that the person will die, but the pasuk already calls him the mace, the one who died. It's like saying the dead person will die. Why does it phrase it in that manner. What it means is that he permitted himself, so to speak, he acknowledged the fact that he understood he was going to get the death penalty. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Chanan says, Eidei Nara HaMeorasa, if we have witnesses in a case of a Nara HaMeorasa, again, that's a young betrothed girl, and she commits adultery, so Shehuzmu, if those Eidim, if they are falsified, they become Eidim Zomamin. Now they are trying to give the death penalty for the adultery, but says Rav Chanan, Ein Neheragin, they do not get killed, even though usually Eidim Zomamin get the punishment that they tried to give. Here they do not get killed. Mitoch sheyecholim lomar laosra al ba'al abanu, because they can say we were really coming to make her forbidden to her husband. We weren't trying to get her killed. We just wanted to acknowledge the fact, to testify to the fact that she committed adultery and she cannot be with her husband. Our intention was not to get her killed. Therefore, if they turn out to be Eidim Zomamin, they don't get killed. But the Gemara says, that doesn't make sense because they warned her. So if they gave her a warning, clearly they did intend to have her killed. And the Gemara says, well, the lo asruba. The case over here is they never gave the warning. But the Gemara says, vi lo asruba, but if they never gave the warning, hechi miktala. So then she wouldn't have been killed. And so then it's obvious what Rav Chanan is saying. They're not trying to get her killed. She would never have gotten killed. Therefore, they're not going to get killed. And the Gemara says, well, be'isha chaveira. Could be we're talking here about a woman who is a chaveira. That means she is knowledgeable. She's a scholar. She's knowledgeable in Torah. And she doesn't require a warning, so she would have gotten killed. I'll leave it to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, because this follows Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda. The Tanya, because we learned in a brayso, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda says, chaver, someone who's knowledgeable in Torah, ein sarach hasra, does not need to be warned. Because the whole purpose of the warning is to know whether the person is doing it by mistake or doing it on purpose. And it's obvious if the person knows the halacha that they are doing it on purpose. But the Gemara continues and still asks, V'kevan de'inhu lo miktali, but once Rav Chanan is saying that they don't get killed because they can claim they were just trying to forbid her to her husband, so how are you going to kill her? That falls into the category of testimony where hazama, where falsification is not possible, because here we're not giving them the punishment that they try to give. And the rule is, anytime you have testimony that you can't falsify, that's not called real testimony, and so therefore she should not get killed either, even if she is a chaveira, even if she's knowledgeable, she cannot be killed based on this testimony. And the Gemara says, Hachinami kamar, indeed, that's exactly what Rav Chanan is saying. Rav Chanan is saying, Mitoch she'ein neheragin, since they cannot be killed, she'yecholin lomar la'osra al ba'al abanu, because they can claim that they were just coming to forbid her to her husband, afi ein neheragis, so too she cannot be killed, by the case again of Nara HaMeorasa, tehavela eidas she'iyat hayachol la'azima, because this turns into a case of eidas she'iyat hayachol la'azima. But the Gemara continues, Ela bi'isha chaveira, but then we have to go back to the case of the woman who's knowledgeable. The kaimal and the mikdal aliv Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, presumably we've established that an isha chaveira, by a Nara HaMeorasa, is killed, according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, because she does not need a warning, she already knows the halacha. But hechi mashkachasla, but how are you ever going to have a situation where she gets killed? Because the Eidim will never be able to get killed, because again, they can claim they're just trying to forbid her to her husband, and it becomes Eidah Shiyat HaYachol Azima. How do you ever have a case of an Isha Chaveira that's going to get the death penalty in this situation? And the Gemara says, well, it could be as follows. Kishazinsa v'chazra v'zinsa. Let's say she committed adultery, and then she goes ahead and commits adultery a second time. She was already forbidden to her husband. In this case, they can't claim they were trying to forbid her to her husband. It is clear they're trying to have her killed, so then they would get killed and she would get killed as well. But the Gemara says, but still, but can't they still say that our intention is not to, it wasn't to forbid her to her husband, because she was already forbidden, this is the second adultery, but maybe they can say their intention was to forbid her to the second boel, to the second man that she committed adultery with. And the Gemara says to that, well, we can have the following scenario, maybe she committed adultery twice, but it was from the same boel with the same man, and so then again, there's nothing the Edom are coming to do other than get her killed. That would be a case where she would get killed and they would get killed as well. Inami, or we can have the following situation, Shazinsa mikrovel, let's say she committed adultery, but she did it with one of her relatives. She was already forbidden to that relative, so they're not coming to forbid her. Rather, it's clear that they're coming to have her killed, and they would get killed as well in that situation. But the Gemara continues, Ma'ishna nara meorasa denaka. But when Rav Chanan said this halacha, again, Rav Chanan said that in a situation where the Edom are coming to testify about the adultery by a Nara HaMeorasa, so his statement was that they don't get killed because they can say they're trying to forbid her to her husband. But why is he talking about a Nara HaMeorasa? That's a very narrow case of adultery. Afilu nesua nami. Even in a situation of a regular married woman, Rav Chanan could say the same thing. If Edom come and testify about a married woman that she committed adultery, they do not get killed. Why don't they get killed? Because they can claim they're just trying to forbid her to her husband. He should have said it in a much broader, simpler case. And the Gemara says, yes, that's actually true. He could have said it there as well. But Afilu hai, he wanted to say that even in a case of Nara Hamorasa, Delo Yasva to say, it's a situation where she was never with him yet, she's just betrothed. They haven't actually been together in the same house. So there, maybe you would say it wouldn't occur to them that they're coming to forbid her to her husband because she's never been with the husband yet. So still, Yechol and Lomar, but still we can say that they're able to say, Le'osra al Ba'ala Banu, that they're coming to forbid her to her husband. His point was that even in a case of Nara Hamorasa, the Eidim can make that claim. And Rashi explains, Afiluha, even in this case of Nara Hamorasa, Delo Yasva, to say she wasn't yet with him, V'ikol HaMeimar, and so we can say, Delo Askwa Datai, would never occur to the witnesses, Le'osra Olav, that they're coming to make her forbidden to him. Sharei lo hayu roim osa Yosheves Tachtav, they never saw her together with him. Afiluachi, nevertheless, Yechol and Lomar, still, they can say that, and therefore, again, Rav Chanan says, they would not get killed. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Chisda says, Echad Omer b'sayif hargu v'echad Omer ba'ariran hargu. Let's say one of the witnesses says that the murder took place and the murderer used a weapon of a sword, and the other one says he used an ariran, another kind of weapon. Ein zen nachon, that's not called nachon, that's not called congruent testimony. We do not accept that testimony because it contradicts, the two witnesses contradicted one another. However, Echad Omer kelev shechor, and if one of them said that the garments of the murderer were black, v'echad Omer kelev levanim, and the other one says the garments of the murderer were white, hareza nachon, that's still considered to be congruent testimony because those are minor details, and we accept that edus. And the Gemara says, Meisvei, we have a question from the following brisa. Again, the pasuk uses the word nachon. The testimony has to be considered congruent. It has to be considered that it lines up. Sheyehei nachon, it means it has to be nachon. Echad Omer b'sayif hargu v'echad Omer ba'ariran hargu. If one says that the murder took place with a sword, the other one says it took place with an ariran. Echad Omer kelev shechor, and if one of the witnesses says that his garments were black, v'echad Omer kelev levanim, or if one of the witnesses says that his garments were white, ein za nachon, that's not called nachon. And so here you see that when it comes to the garments, Rav Chisda said that it's nachon, but here in the Brisa it's saying that's not considered to be good testimony. And the Gemara says, Tir Gemara Rav Chisda will interpret this Brisa, besudar shechon kubo, the garments here we're talking about are the actual scarf that was used to strangle the person. Dahainu sayif ariron, that's the same thing as confusing the sword and the ariron, meaning to say, we're talking here about the weapon. If you confuse the weapon, that already is not nachon, and that does not contradict Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda was talking about when you confuse the garments that the murderer is wearing. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof, Echad Omer sandal of Shechorin, ve'echad Omer sandal of Levonim. One says that his shoes were black, one says that his shoes were white. Ein za nachon, that's not considered to be congruent testimony. Again, it seems to be against Rav Chisda. And the Gemara says, Hasam Nami, there also will just say, Kagon Shabbat bo b'sandal of Hargo. He kicked him with his sandal, and that's how he killed him. It was the murder weapon, that's why it's not considered nachon in this case. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof, this is from our Mishnah. Maisa ubadak ben Zakkai bu'ukse ta'ena. There was an incident where Ben Zakkai was conducting examinations with regards to the stems of the figs. There certainly does not seem to be talking about the murder weapon. The Gemara says, not necessarily. Amar Rami Bar Chama says, Kegon sha'akatz ta'ena b'Shabbos. What we're talking about in that case is where the person actually picked the fig on Shabbos, so that was what he had done in order to violate Shabbos. The Allah kamiktal, he's being killed with regards to this particular fig, so there already that's similar to an examination with regards to the murder weapon. But the Gemara continues, that's not true. Vatanya, but we learned in a Brisa, Amru lo tachas te'ena hargo, that the case over here actually was not picking a fig on Shabbos. It's when they say to him that the person committed murder underneath the particular fig tree. And so the Gemara says, El Amar Rami Bar Chama, rather Rami Bar Chama says, we'll still say the same answer as above. Kegon shashafto biyichor shal te'ena. What he did was he poked him, he killed him using the branch of a fig tree. So again, it was an inconsistency specifically with regards to the murder weapon. But the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof, because Ben Zakkai, when he was talking about this examination by the stems of the figs, Amar Len, he said to them, Ta'ena zu uksadakin, uksagasin. They say to him, these figs, are the stems, were they thin, were they larger? Ta'enim shechoros, were the figs themselves black? Ta'enim levanos, were the figs themselves white? And so clearly in this understanding, when Ben Zakkai is talking about not only the actual stems, but the figs also, clearly we're not talking about the weapon over here, and yet he says that would be considered incongruent testimony. And so the Gemara says, El Amar Rav Yosef, rather Rav Yosef says, Mi Ben Zakkai losev inish, are you trying to ask a question from Ben Zakkai? Ben Zakkai has a unique opinion. Shani Ben Zakkai is different. To bedikos kechakiros mashvile, he considers the examination questions the same as the chakiros, the same as the interrogation questions, and therefore even any inconsistency within those is going to make the testimony incongruent. and that's why Ben Zakkai has a unique shita, but that has nothing to do with what Rav Chisda said. And the Gemara continues, Man Ben Zakkai, who is this Ben Zakkai that's referred to in the Mishnah? Ilema Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, if you say that we're talking in the Mishnah about Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, Mihave B'Sanhedri, was he in the Sanhedrin at this time that they were judging capital cases? V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa, Kol Shnosav Shel Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, Meya Ve'esrim Shana. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, he lived for 120 years. Arboim Shana Asak Be'Pragmatya, for 40 years he dealt in business. Mem Shana Lamad, for 40 years he learned. Arboim Shana Limed, and for 40 years he taught. V'tanya, we learned in a brisa, Arboim Shana Kodim Churban Habayis, 40 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, Golsa Sanhedri, that's when the Sanhedrin was exiled. V'yash v'la b'chanus, and they settled themselves in a store. This is a store near the Beis HaMikdash. V'yamar Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi, and Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi says, Lomar, what it means to say is that 40 years before the destruction, it means to say, Shelo Danu Dine Knasos, that they were not judging anymore cases involving fines. The Gemara says, Dine Knasos al Kadaitach, you think they would stop judging cases of fines? Why would they stop that? Ela Shelo Danu Dine Nefashos, rather what it means is that 40 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, they were no longer judging capital cases. Utzanan, we also learned in the Mishnah, Mishachara Beis HaMikdash, that from when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Hiskin Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, that's when Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, he made certain takonas, he made certain decrees, and Rashi explains, Bechanus, again the Sanhedrin was exiled to this Chanus, Mokum Haya B'Yerushalayim, this was a certain place in Yerushalayim, V'kein Shemo, that was its name, Dine Knasos al Kadaitach, do you think that we're talking about Dine Knasos, V'chi Lishkas HaGazis Go Remes, L'Dine Knasos, the fact that they're not in the Lishkas HaGazis in the Beis HaMikdash, that's the reason why the Sanhedrin is not able to judge cases of fines. Eladine Nefashos, rather what we must be talking about is they're not judging capital cases. She'ein Dine Nefashos b'chol makom, ela ba'ot Sanhedrin no heges, b'lishkas hagazis. You can't judge capital cases except when the Sanhedrin is in the Lishkas hagazis. Shenemers, it says v'kamta v'yolisa el hamakom, you have to go to the place. Malamid sha'hamakom gorim, we see that the place is important. It causes that you're able to have these kinds of cases. V'kevon dechazu denefishi rotzchem v'lohayu maspikin lodun amdu v'golu misham, since they saw there were a lot of murderers and they weren't able to judge them all, so they exiled themselves from the Lishkas HaGazis. Utnanan, we learned in the Mishnah Mishachara Beis HaMikdash that when the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, that's when Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai made certain takonis. And so now Rashi explains the question, V'kevan Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai hayakayim achar churban, if it turns out that Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai was alive after the destruction, nimsa da'arboim shenosav achronim, then it turns out that his last 40 years, meaning the last 40 years of his life, lo danu nefashos, so then they weren't judging dina nefashos to harboim kodem churban batlu, because already 40 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, they stopped judging cases of dina nefashos. The Gemara means to say that Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, only in the last 40 years of his life would he have joined the Sanhedrin, and in the 40 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash already, they were not judging dina nefashos, so it was impossible that Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai was on the Sanhedrin at a time that they were judging dina nefashos. And so the Gemara continues and answers, Ella Ben Zakkai di'alma, rather the Mishnah must be talking about some other Ben Zakkai who was involved in the Sanhedrin and Dina Nefashos cases, because again, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai would not have been involved in Dina Nefashos in the Sanhedrin. And the Gemara continues, Hachanam Mistavra, it makes sense to say this, Disal Gadaydach Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, because if you think we're talking about Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, Karile Rabbi Ben Zakkai, do you think Rabbi in the Mishnah would refer to him as Ben Zakkai? Why would he refer to Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai as Ben Zakkai? That's a different person. But the Gemara says that can't be Vatanya, but we learned in a brayso Maisa Ubadak Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai B'Ukseitain, that there was an incident, and it clearly says in this brayso Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai did examinations with regards to the stems of the figs. So clearly we are talking about Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, and again Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai was only a judge in the last 40 years of his life, and we know that he lived after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, and in that last 40 years before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash already, they were not judging Dina Nefashos. So how was he involved in cases of Dina Nefashos? And so the Gemara answers, Ella, rather, Talmud Hayoshev Lifnei Rabo Have, at the time that they were still judging Dina Nefashos cases, and he was not a judge, but he was a student who was sitting in front of his Rebbe. V'yamar Milso Mistaver Lutaime, and he just said something, and it seemed logical to the other judges. That's what's being quoted in the Mishnah when it says Ben Zakkai did these examinations. It doesn't mean he was a judge. It meant that he suggested these examinations while he was a student of the court. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Aleph Amud Beis.